Presento ahora al invitado internacional quien realizará la conferencia magistral de inauguración del segundo día a cargo del doctor Henry Giroux de la McMaster University de Canadá. Henry realizó sus estudios en el Instituto de Educación Secundaria de Barrington, Rhode Island, en 1977. Se doctoró en la Universidad de Carnegie Mellon. Entre los años de 1977 y 1983 fue profesor en la Facultad de Educación de la Universidad de Boston. En 1983 ingresó a la Facultad de Educación y renombrado Scholar in Residence en la Universidad de Miami, donde también ocupó el puesto de director del Centro para la Educación y Estudios Culturales. Posteriormente se trasladó a la Universidad Estatal de Pensilvania, donde asumió la cátedra de profesorado Waterbury de 1992 a mayo del 2004. También fue director del Foro Waterbury en Educación y Estudios Culturales. En mayo de 2004 ingresó a la Universidad McMaster, donde actualmente ostenta la cátedra de Cadenas Globales de Televisión en la carrera de Ciencias de la Comunicación. En el año 2005, la Universidad Memorial de Canadá le concedió un doctorado honorario en Letras. El tema de su conferencia del doctor Giroux es la pedagogía crítica y la lucha contra la cultura fascista en tiempos de pandemia, reclamando el legado de Paulo Freire. Esta ponencia es sin traducción simultánea, sin embargo se pegará su traducción en el chat de YouTube para que tengan mayor claridad sobre ello. Doctor Henry Giroux, ahora sí, el espacio es todo suyo. Muchas gracias.
Yes, Professor Giroux, yes, you can start now. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. September 19th was Paulo Freire's birthday. Freddie and I worked together for 15 years, which I consider one of the most enlightening periods of my life. We co-edited a book series, and along with Donaldo Macedo, got many of course, Paulo's books translated and published in the English-speaking world. Paulo also wrote the preface for my second book, Theory and Resistance in Education, and we collaborated together until he died. Freire was a revolutionary whose passion for justice and resistance was matched by his hatred of neoliberal capitalism and his loathing for authoritarianism of all stripes. Put simply, he was not simply a public intellectual, but also a freedom fighter. The current attacks on him in Brazil by the neo-fascist Bolsonaro make clear how dangerous his work is even today. Freire's legacy is particularly important in an age when fascism is on the rise again across the globe. It's important not only to reclaim his memory and work in the current moment, but also crucial to acknowledge his emphasis on the centrality of education to politics and politics to education. Paulo believed that people had to be informed in order to act in the name of justice. He insisted that all education in the broadest sense was part of a project of freedom and eminently political because it offered students the conditions for self-reflection, a self-managed life, and particular notions of critical agency. He rejected the view that education was about training, teaching for the text or test, or a neutral method of transmission. For Freire, pedagogy was a political and moral practice that provides the knowledge, the skills, and the social relations that enable students to explore the possibility of what it means to be critically engaged citizens while expanding and deepening their participation in the promise of what I would call a radical democracy. Critical pedagogy for Freire was not an object lesson in test taking, but a tool for self-determination and civic engagement. He believed that the value of education, civic literacy, and critical pedagogy could be measured by how much it improved people's lives, gave them a sense of hope, and pointed to a future that was more just and free of oppression and domination. He believed that politics followed culture and that there was no possibility for social change unless there was a change in people's attitudes, in their consciousness, and how they lived their lives. Freire rightly argued that a critical education could teach young people, the oppressed and others, to be critically and socially responsive and to take risk in the name of a future of hope and democratic possibilities. He connected education to social change, believing that matters of identity, desire, power, and values were never far removed from political and educational struggles. Paulo provides a model of what it means to talk back, scorn easy popularity while refusing to wallow in the discourse of comfortable platitudes. Paulo was not merely a witness to injustice, he was also appalled by the silence of good people. He made clear that there had to be a crucial element of love and solidarity in the ability to feel passionate about freedom and social justice, and that education was crucial to such a project. It is in the spirit of that critique and hope that today I want to connect Paulo's work with the current crisis that education faces in a time of tyranny across the globe. Across the globe, education has increasingly become a tool of domination as right-wing pedagogical apparatuses controlled by the entrepreneurs of hate attack workers, the poor, people of color, refugees, immigrants from the South, and others considered disposable. In the midst of an era when an older social order is crumbling and a new one is struggling to define itself, there emerges a time of confusion, danger, and moments of great restlessness. We have arrived at a moment in which two worlds are colliding, and a history of the present is poised at a point when possibilities are either realized or rejected, but they never disappear completely. First, there is the harsh and crumbling worlds of neoliberal globalization and its mobilizing passions that fuel different strands of fascism across the globe, particularly right now in the United States. Power is now enamored of amassing profits and capital and is increasingly addicted to a politics of white nationalism and racial cleansing. Second, there are growing counter movements, especially among young people, with their search for a new politics in which to rethink, reclaim, and reinvent a new understanding of democratic socialism untainted by capitalism. And we saw this with the massive revolts on the part of young people, of course, in Chile. What is not in doubt is that something sinister and horrifying is happening to liberal democracies across the globe. Yet, as alarming as the signs may be, the public cannot look away and allow the terrors of the unthinkable to be given free rein. For those of us who believe in a radical democracy, we cannot allow the power of dreams and militant hopes to turn into ashes. We now live in a world that resembles a dystopian novel. The COVID-19 crisis created a surrealist nightmare that floods our screens and our media with images of fear, anxiety, death, and massive inequalities in addressing the crisis. What must be acknowledged is that the pandemic is more than a medical concept. It also refers to an ideological and political set of plagues that emerged as a result of the blundering and irresponsible response of the United States and other countries, such as Brazil, the United Kingdom, India, to the COVID-19 crisis. Marked by inept leadership, rooted in a distrust of science, evidence, reason, and a blind allegiance to market forces, what has emerged over time is an unimaginable degree of suffering, massive deaths, and a further legitimation of lies and right-wing violence. The horror of the pandemic often blinds us to the fact that anti-democratic economic and political forces that have prioritized profits over human needs have grinded away at the social order for the last 40 years. Since the 1970s, a form of gangster capitalism has waged war on the welfare state, public sphere, and the common good, including public and higher education. And as a form of predatory capitalism, neoliberalism believes that the market should govern the economy, not just the economy, but all aspects of society. It concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a financial elite, and it elevates unchecked self-interest, self-help, deregulation, and privatization to the governing principles of society. Under neoliberalism, everything is for sale. The only obligation of citizenship appears to be consumerism. At the same time, it ignores basic human needs such as healthcare, food, decent wages, and quality education. Neoliberalism views government as the enemy of the market, limits society to the realm of the family and individual, and embraces a fixed hedonism and challenges, to say the least, the very idea of the public good. We live in an age in which economic activity is divorced from social cost, while policies that produce racial cleansing, militarism, environmental destruction, and staggering inequality have become defining features of everyday life and established modes of governance. Clearly, there is a need for educators, among others, to reclaim the notion of economic and racial justice, in which matters of social responsibility, equity, and equality become the central features of a radical democracy. Moreover, the pandemic revealed in all of its ugliness the death-producing mechanisms of systemic inequality, deregulation, a culture of cruelty, and an increasingly dangerous assault on the environment, particularly evident, to say the very least, in Brazil. It has also made visible an anti-intellectual culture that derides any notion of critical education. That is, an education that equips people to think critically, take risks, think outside the box, engage in thoughtful dialogue, appropriate lessons of history, and learn how to hold power accountable. It is hard to imagine a more urgent moment for taking Freire's ongoing attempts to make education central to politics. At stake for Freire was the notion that education was a social concept, a political concept, one rooted in the goal of emancipation for all people. Moreover, this is an education that encourages human agency, one that is not content to enable people to only be critical thinkers, but also engage intellectuals and social agents. This is a pedagogy that calls us beyond ourselves and engages the ethical imperative to care for others, dismantle structures of domination, and become subjects rather than the objects of power, the politics, and history. If we're going to develop a politics capable of awakening our critical, imaginative, and historical sensibilities, it's crucial for educators and others to remember Freire's ongoing project of critical literacy and education as a project of individual and collective empowerment. This was a political project in which civic literacy is infused with the language of critique and possibility. Such a language is necessary to enable the conditions to forge a collective international resistance among educators, youth, artists, and other cultural workers in defense of the public good and social justice. Such a movement is important to resist and overcome the tyrannical fascist nightmares that have descended upon the United States, Brazil, and a number of other countries plagued by right-wing populist movements. In an age of social isolation, information overflow, and a culture of immediacy, cultural consumer glut, and spectacularized knowledge and violence, it is all the more crucial to take seriously the notion that democracy cannot exist or be defended without civically literate, informed, and critically engaged citizens. Education, both in its symbolic and institutional forms, has a central role to play in fighting the resurgence of anti-democratic cultures, mythic historical narratives, and the emerging ideologies of white supremacy and white nationalism. Moreover, as far-right extremists across the globe are disseminating toxic, racist, and ultra-nationalist images of the past, it's essential to reclaim education and critical pedagogy through the lens of historical consciousness and moral witnessing. This is especially true at a time when historical and social amnesia have become a national pastime masked only by the masculinization and militarization of the public sphere and the increasing normalization of a fascist politics that thrives on ignorance, fear, the suppression of dissent, and hate. Education is a form of cultural work that extends far beyond the classroom, and its pedagogical influence to often imperceptible other sources is crucial to challenging and resisting the rise of fascist pedagogical formations and their rehabilitation of fascist principles and ideas. My point here is that education is not simply about schooling. The pedagogical lesson here is that fascism begins with hateful words, the domination of others considered disposable, and moves on to attack ideas, the burning of books, the disappearance of intellectuals, and the horrors of detention jails and camps. As a form of cultural politics, critical pedagogy provides the premise of a protected space within which to think against the grain of received opinion, a space to question and to challenge, to imagine the world from different standpoints and perspectives, and to reflect upon ourselves in relation to others, and in doing so, to understand what it means to assume a sense of political and social responsibility. Cultural politics since the 1980s has turned toxic. Ruling elites have increasingly gained control of commanding cultural apparatuses, turning them into pedagogical disimagination machines that serve the forces of ethical tranquilization by producing and legitimating endless degrading and humiliating images of the poor, immigrants, Muslims, workers, and others dismissed as excess, doomed to terminal exclusion. In the new landscapes of wealth, fraud, and social atomization, a savage and fanatical capitalism promotes a winner-take-all ethos, normalizes massive inequalities in wealth and power, and aggressively undermines the welfare state while pushing millions into hardship and misery. The geographies of moral and political decadence have become the organizing standards of the dream worlds of consumption, privatization, surveillance, and deregulation. And within this increasingly fascist landscape, public spheres are replaced by zones of social abandonment and thrive on a culture of manufactured ignorance, cruelty, and misery. Education within the last 3 decades has diminished rapidly in its capacities to educate young people and others to be reflective, critical, and socially engaged agents. Under neoliberal regimes, the utopian possibilities formerly associated with public and higher education as a public good, capable of promoting social equity and supporting democracy, have become too dangerous for the apostles of authoritarianism. Increasingly, public schools are subject to the poisonous forces of privatization and mindless standardization curricula, while teachers are de-skilled and subject to intolerable labor conditions. Higher education now mimics a business culture run by a managerial army of bureaucrats enamored of market values who resemble the high priest of a deadening instrumental rationality. In the age of the pandemic, pedagogy is reduced to a crude instrumental rationality focused on training exercises to familiarize teachers and students with Zoom, Teams, and other methods of online teaching. The commanding visions of democracy are in exile at all levels of education. Critical thought and the imagining of a better world present a direct threat to authoritarians who believe that the future must always replicate the present in an endless circle in which capital and the identities that it legitimates merge with each other into what might be called a dead zone of the imagination and pedagogies of repression. Pedagogy has been instrumentalized in multiple sites, privatized, and reproduced a culture that is anti-intellectual and disdains the truth, evidence, and social justice. As a result, the distinction between education and training has collapsed, and the most valued educational experiences are geared to job preparation. Young people are now told to invest in their careers, pack their resumes, and achieve success at any cost. It is precisely this replacement of educated hope with an aggressive dystopian neoliberal project in cultural politics that now characterizes the current assault on public and higher education in various parts of the world. Under neoliberalism, the mantra of privatization, deregulation, and the destruction of the public good is matched by a toxic merging of inequality, greed, and the nativist language of borders, walls, and camps. It's crucial for educators to remember that language is not simply an instrument of violence, fear, and intimidation. It's also a vehicle for critique, civic courage, resistance, and engaged and informed agency. We live at a time when the language of democracy has been pillaged, stripped of its promises and hopes. For instance, in the age of alleged fake news and post-truth, the degradation of language reinforces Umberto Eco's claim that education as an organizing feature of fascism undermines civic literacy and produces an impoverished vocabulary and elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. If right-wing populism and authoritarianism are to be defeated, there's a need to make education an organizing principle of politics, and in part, this can be done with a language that exposes, unravels the falsehoods, the systems of oppression, and corrupt relations of power while making clear that an alternative future is possible. Hannah Arendt was right in arguing that language is crucial in highlighting the often hidden, crystallized elements that make fascism likely. Language is a powerful tool in the search for truth and the condemnation of falsehoods and injustices. Moreover, it's through language that the history of fascism can be remembered, and the lessons of the conditions that created the plague of genocide can provide the recognition that fascism does not reside solely in the past, and that its traces are always dormant, even in the strongest democracies. This is one more reason for educators to make the political more pedagogical and the pedagogical more political. As Freire reminds us, pedagogy is always a struggle over agencies, identities, desires, and values, while also acknowledging that it is crucial, that it has a crucial role to play in addressing important social issues and defending public and higher education as democratic public spheres. Making the political pedagogical in this instance suggests producing modes of knowledge and social practices that not only affirm oppositional cultural work and pedagogical practices, but also offer the opportunity to mobilize instances of collective struggle coupled with direct mass action. Such mobilizations, especially when directed against neoliberalism, must oppose the glaring material inequities and the growing cynical belief that democracy and capitalism are synonymous. At the very least, critical pedagogy proposes that education is a form of political intervention in the world and that it's capable of creating the possibilities for individual and social transformation. Ignorance now rules America, Brazil, India, and other right-wing countries caught in a tsunami of lies and conspiracy theories. This is not the simple of somewhat innocent ignorance that comes from the absence of knowledge, but a malicious ignorance forged in the arrogance of refusing to think hard about an issue, to engage language in the pursuit of justice. James Baldwin was certainly right in issuing a stern warning in his book, No Name in the Street, that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. Thinking is now viewed as an act of stupidity, and thoughtlessness is considered a virtue. All traces of critical thought appear only at the margins of a culture. The social media and corporate control cultural apparatuses not only normalize ignorance, but they also position themselves as the enemy of critical thinking, dissent, engaged intellectuals, and emancipatory forms of education. Ignorance, again, is not innocent, especially when it labels thinking dangerous, while establishing disdain for the truth, scientific evidence, and rational judgments. Moreover, there is more at stake here than the production of a toxic form of illiteracy celebrated as common sense, the normalization of fake news, and the shrinking of political horizons. There is also the closing of the horizons of the political and pedagogical, coupled with an explicit expression of cruelty and a widely sanctioned ruthlessness. The very conditions that enable people to make informed decisions are under siege as schools are defunded, media become more corporatized, oppositional journalists are killed, and reality TV becomes the model for mass entertainment. We now live in a new age of cruelty in which we are told that the central mark of our agency is to be at war with each other, unleash our most ruthless competitive side, and learn how to survive in a cutthroat jungle of late capitalism. Under such circumstances, there is a full-scale attack on thoughtful reasoning, empathy, collective resistance, and the compassionate imagination. In some ways, the dictatorship of ignorance resembles what the writer John Berger calls ethicide, and Joshua Sperling defines as the blunting of the senses, the hollowing out of language, the erasure of connection with the past, the dead, place, the land, the soil, possibility, even the erasure of certain emotions with a pity, compassion, consoling, mourning, or hoping. Words such as love, trust, freedom, responsibility, and choice have been deformed by a market logic that narrows their meaning to either an advertisement, commodity, or a reductive notion of self-interest. Freedom now means removing oneself from any sense of social responsibility so one can retreat into the privatized orbits of self-indulgence. And so it goes. The new form of illiteracy does not simply constitute an absence of learning, ideas, or knowledge, nor can it be simply attributed to what has been called the smartphone society. On the contrary, it's a willful practice whose purpose is to actively depoliticize people and make them complicit with the forces that impose misery and suffering upon their lives. Given the current crisis of politics, agency, history, and memory, educators need a new political language, a new pedagogical language for addressing the changing context and issues facing a world in which capital draws upon an unprecedented convergence of resources, financial, cultural, political, economic, scientific, military, and technological, to exercise powerful and diverse forms of control. If educators and others are to counter global capitalism's increased ability to separate the traditional sphere of politics from the transnational reach of power, it's crucial to develop educational approaches that reject the collapse of the distinction between market liberties and civil liberties, a market economy and a market society. Resistance does not begin with reforming capitalism, but abolishing it. In this instance, critical pedagogy is crucial in the fight to revive civic literacy, civic culture, and a notion of shared citizenship. Politics loses its emancipatory possibilities if it cannot provide the educational conditions for enabling students and others to think critically, realize themselves as engaged citizens willing to fight for social change in the name of a socialist democracy. There is no radical politics without a pedagogy capable of awakening consciousness, challenging common sense, and creating modes of analysis in which people discover a moment of recognition that enables them to think and to rethink the conditions that shape their lives. As a rule, educators should do more than create the conditions for critical thinking and nourishing a sense of hope for their students and others. They also need to responsibly assume the role of civic educators within broader social context and be willing to share their ideas with other educators in the wider public by making use of new media technologies and other forms of cultural production. Communicating to a variety of public audiences suggests using opportunities for writing, public talks, and media interviews offered by the radio, internet, alternative magazines, while also teaching young people and adults in alternative schools, to name only a few options. Capitalizing on their role as public intellectuals, faculty can speak to more general audiences in a language that is clear, accessible, and vigorous. More importantly, as teachers organize to assert both the importance of their role as citizen educators and intellectuals and that of education and in democracy, they can also forge new alliances and connections to develop with social movements that include and expand beyond working with unions. In the current moment, it is all the more crucial to embrace critical pedagogy as a practice of freedom that cannot be removed from issues of power, assigned meanings, and definitions of the future. In addition, pedagogy as a form of production and critique offers a discourse of possibility, a way of providing students with the opportunity to link understanding to commitment and social transformation to seeking the greatest possible forms of justice. This suggests one of the most serious challenges facing teachers, artists, journalists, writers, and other cultural workers, which is the risk of developing a language, a discourse, and pedagogical practices that connect a critical reading of both the word and the world in ways that embrace the creative capacities of young people and provide the conditions for them to be critical, to become critical agents, a theme that Paulo Freire repeatedly took up in his life. In talking about this project, educators and others should attempt to create the conditions that give students the opportunity to acquire the knowledge, values, and civic courage that enable them to struggle in order to make distillation and cynicism unconvincing and hope practical. Hope, in this instance, is educational, removed from the fantasy of an idealism that is unaware of the constraints facing the struggle for a democratic society. Educated hope is not a call to overlook the difficult conditions that shape both schools and the larger social order, nor is it a blueprint removed from specific contexts and struggles. On the contrary, it is the precondition for imagining a future that does not replicate the nightmares of the present, for not making the present the future. Educated hope should be a form of active social hope that dignifies the labor of teachers, offers up critical knowledge linked to democratic social change, affirms shared responsibilities, and encourages teachers and students to recognize ambivalence and uncertainty as fundamental dimensions of learning. Such hope offers the possibility for thinking beyond the given, to say the very least. As difficult as this task may seem to educators, if not to a public, is a struggle worth waging. Without hope, even in dire times, there is no possibility for resistance, dissent, and struggle. Agency is the condition of struggle, and hope is the condition of agency. Hope expands the space of the possible and becomes a way of recognizing and naming the incomplete nature of the present. In the end, there is no democracy without informed citizens and no justice without a language critical of injustice. Democracy begins to fail and political life becomes impoverished in the absence of those vital public spheres, such as public and higher education, in which civic values, public scholarship, and social engagement allow for a more imaginative grasp of a future that takes seriously the demands of justice, equity, and civic courage. Democracy should be a way of thinking about education, one that thrives on connecting pedagogy to the practice of freedom, learning to ethics, and agency to the imperatives of social responsibility and the public good. The fact remains that without hope, there is no agency, and without collective agents, there's no hope of collective resistance. In the age of nascent fascism, it is not enough to connect education with the defense of reason, informed judgment, and critical consciousness. It must also be aligned with the power and potential of collective resistance. We live in dangerous times, and consequently, there's an urgent need for more individuals, institutions, and social movements to come together in the belief that the current regimes of demagogues can be resisted, that alternative futures are possible, and that acting on those beliefs through collective resistance will make radical change happen. Returning to the legacy of Paulo Freire, it is crucial to remember that he provided a vision in an age that seems to lack one, and in doing so argued for connecting education, critical pedagogy, and civic literacy to a sense of responsibility in the face of the unspeakable. He was a transformative scholar and public intellectual who inspired educators and other cultural workers to act with conviction, self-reflection, and the courage necessary to confront the barbarians that want to return to a past of fear, terror, conformity, and oppression. Paulo taught us not only how to learn from the past, but also what it means to work in the shadow of a life committed to justice, equity, joy, and civic courage. Thank you.